Ever since I put this router table into the extension wing of my table saw, I've been trying to think of a way to utilize the featherboards that came with the router table. A featherboard, for those that don't know, is a device that pushes a workpiece against a fence or the table as you're passing over a bit or a blade. The router table actually had them mounted vertically, but I want to come up with some way to mount these horizontally to put pressure on a workpiece against a fence. And so that's what I'll do in this video, come up with a way to mount these to the actual table. So this is everything that I used for this project. 4 knobs came with the router table, 4 bolts also from the table that fit those knobs. These threaded inserts, which I think also came with, that fit the bolts. 4 washers I had lying around, 2 drill bits, some type of adhesive, I actually used epoxy, pencil, hex key, and some sort of spacer. So first thing is layout. I want to put these two as close together as I possibly can without the knobs I'm going to be using knocking into each other, so right about there. So the basic plan is to take 4 threaded inserts and drive them into the table, and then use a bolt fixed permanently in a knob to screw into that insert to clamp the featherboard to the table when I want to use them, and I'll be able to adjust them forward and backward. So I'm using a piece of scrap here, and I'm lining it up with the middle of the router spindle, and that's going to give me a spacing just enough so that the knobs that I'll be using won't knock into each other. And once I have the spacing just where I want it, I draw a line with the pencil down what seems to be the middle of each slot. It doesn't need to be exactly precise, but try and be as close as you can. After I have that line drawn, I take a center punch and just punch anywhere on that line. Again, it doesn't need to be the exact same height or whatever on each line, just anywhere will do. So here I'm measuring how far deep to drill for the threaded inserts. And the thing to do is just take the threaded insert, put it up against the drill bit, and use a piece of tape to mark on the bit as a reference as to where you should stop drilling. It's fairly simple, and I gave myself a little bit of slack, so I drill a little bit deeper than necessary. I'm using a square here just to eyeball to make sure that I'm drilling pretty close to 90 degrees to the table. It's not mission critical that this hole be exactly 90 degrees into the table, but it doesn't hurt to be as close as you can. So you could use a drill block to help guide your drill, but I didn't have one, so a square will do in a pinch. So the holes I drilled are big enough for the threads, but the top portion of the insert has this flange, as you can see here, that requires me to drill a bit of a recess for it to sit flush or below the table. The drill bit I was going to use for that was too big, so I grabbed a Forstner bit instead, and I drilled into a scrap piece of wood with that bit and used it as a drill guide just to make sure everything was lined up properly, I didn't get any tear out. And that seemed to work very well. I forgot to record the portion where I drove in the inserts, but it was very simple. Just use a hex key, and I used some Gorilla Glue to make sure it held in this MDF very well. And the bolts travel in and out just fine, so I think I'm ready to move on to the next step. So I have to modify these bolts so they're threaded at both ends, so I have to shear this top portion off. If you put a bolt in a vise, it's probably going to damage the threads, so the thing to do is to put it in a block of wood, which you've drilled a hole in, and ideally cut a slit with something like a bandsaw. So you put the bolt in the scrap and clamp it down in the vise, and that holds it really tight. So now I'm just going to shear off the top, and I want to be careful to not cut off too much of the thread because it's going to be a stretch to make sure these reach to the insert anyway. This process leaves some burrs on the end, and so the thing to do is to come back with a die and just kind of recut those threads just to take off that burr and freshen up any threads that might have gotten damaged in the process. So after I've cleaned the threads up, I take the bolts and twist them down into the inserts just enough so they don't pull back out. And then I drop the featherboards on top of those bolts. You can see the left side here I actually have to stretch because I drilled those holes a little too far apart, but it'll be okay. I drop on the washers, and now it's time to mix up my glue. I decided to go with epoxy over CA glue, super glue, because I absolutely did not want this to fail, and this is the strongest glue I have. So I squeeze it out, I mix it up, and I apply it to 2 spots. One, I apply it to the inside threads of the knob, so stick it down in that hole there and rub it on the threads. That's going to lock the bolt on those threads so it doesn't twist when I twist the knob. Then I apply some glue to the flat part of the knob on the bottom, the flange, so it will bond well to the washer. So washer, bolt, knob, once the glue dries, will be one solid piece. I would recommend taking the time to rough up the flange and rough up the washer with some sandpaper. I did that for 3 of these knobs, but not for one, and the one that I did not do that for actually failed. So take the time to run some 80 grit or so sandpaper over the flange and the washer before you attach your glue. So the next day, after the glues had a chance to dry, I decided to give it a test run. So I took the featherboards and screwed them down, and aside from having to stretch the left one out a little bit because the holes are too far apart, it worked just like I'd planned. They went in and they held tremendously well when all of the bolts were screwed down. So now I'm going to do a test cut. If you watch, you can see the fingers of the featherboards engage the wood as I pass it over the router bit. And if you've done a cut like this before, you know how nice it is to not have to worry about keeping constant pressure of the wood against the fence, especially on thinner pieces. And this is how it turned out. It looks, to the eye test, to be a fantastic cut. No dips, no valleys, no tearing. So I'm actually very happy with this result.